The dim evening light slipped through the thin curtains of the old wooden house, brushing softly against the faded rugs and the delicate dust floating lazily in the air. And the grandmother sat there quietly, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap, her shoulders wrapped in a hand-woven shawl she had owned for decades. Its threads worn but warm, its colors faded but comforting. And beside her on the floor sat her young grandchild, legs crossed, eyes wide, their innocent face glowing in the soft amber light, as if absorbing every detail of the moment without yet knowing why it mattered so much. The grandmother exhaled deeply, her breath trembling slightly as though it carried years she had never spoken aloud. And she lifted her gaze to the child with a faint smile that held both warmth and sorrow. The kind of smile that had been shaped by long nights, broken promises, and memories she had learned to hold gently so they wouldn't bruise her anymore. She touched the child's cheek with the back of her fingers, slow and tender, and said in a voice quiet but full of old strength, "There are stories, my dear, that we carry alone for many years. Stories we think the world will never understand." And her grandchild leaned closer, small fingers curling around her wrist, looking up at her with unwavering trust, waiting for her to begin, unaware that tonight she would peel open the layers of a life filled with devastation, endurance, and the kind of love that hurts and heals at the same time. She turned slightly, gazing out the window where dusk settled over the small New York neighborhood, a place where she had lived almost her entire adult life, where every street had a memory tied to her heart, where every winter storm had tested her, and every spring morning had reminded her she had survived another year. And as the wind carried the faint scent of rain, she started to speak, her voice dipping into the past, into the days when she was young and the world felt big and promising and unforgiving all at once. She spoke of her early years in a cramped apartment where she raised her son with hands that were always busy, hands that cooked, cleaned, repaired, comforted, prayed, and worked extra shifts she was too tired to take but too desperate to refuse, just to give him a chance at a life better than hers. She spoke of the night she'd return home with aching feet, peeling off her worn shoes while her boy slept soundly in the next room, unaware that she had walked miles in the snow because she didn't have enough bus fare for both her and the groceries. She described the way she used to sit on the edge of his bed, brushing aside his hair and whispering promises to him that she would always be there, that he would never be alone, that she would find a way, somehow, no matter how hard the world pushed her down. The child listened silently, their eyes glistening in the warm glow of the room, as if sensing that every word carried a piece of a secret she had never told anyone. The grandmother continued, recalling the years when her son grew older and the distance began to form. Slowly, at first a forgotten phone call, a missed holiday visit, an excuse here and there, until one day she realized she had spent more time waiting for him than with him, and how each time he chose someone or something else over her. She quietly folded the hurt away like a fragile letter she was afraid would tear if she opened it too often. She explained how she never complained, never raised her voice, because a mother's love, she believed, was meant to endure, meant to last longer than abandonment, meant to forgive even when her heart felt like breaking under the weight of being forgotten. And the child's small hand squeezed her fingers as though trying to hold her together, offering comfort with a purity only children possess. Her voice wavered as she began to reveal the darkest chapter, the day she was told she could not attend her own son's wedding. The words delivered casually, almost carelessly, as though she were not the woman who had fed him, clothed him, prayed for him, or held him through sickness and fear. She told the child how her son, now grown and lost inside a world she no longer understood, had called her one quiet afternoon and said, "Mom, it's better if you don't come. It's complicated," and how she had sat there in stunned silence, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white, unable to speak as her heart cracked in places she did not know could still break, and how she had forced herself to respond with kindness, telling him she understood, even though the truth was that she had never felt more discarded in her life. The orange evening light slowly dimmed in the little house, as if the sun itself was listening to the old woman speak. Eleanor shifted slightly in her chair, her back aching the way old memories ache, slow, deep, and stubborn. Lily rested her small head against her grandmother's arm, her fingers lightly wrapped around the soft, wrinkled skin that had survived a lifetime of cold winters, heartbreak, and stubborn endurance. Eleanor's eyes clouded, not with confusion, but with the heaviness of remembering a time when hope felt like a thin thread she clung to with shaking hands. When I first came to New York, she began softly, her voice trembling like a leaf in a quiet breeze. I felt like a stranger in a world that didn't know my name. The city had been loud, impatient, indifferent, a place where millions lived within inches of each other. Yet loneliness echoed louder than the subway lines. She remembered standing on a slushy Brooklyn sidewalk with only a cheap coat wrapped around her growing belly. Every passing car sprayed cold water onto her shoes, and every hurried stranger brushed past her as though she were invisible. She spoke almost no English, had no family, no money besides $200 crumpled in her pocket, and no one to turn to accept the tiny life growing inside her. That tiny heartbeat was her only companion, her only reason to keep breathing. She told Lily about her exhausting search for work, how she knocked on countless doors, how she cleaned greasy restaurant floors for $10 a night, washed dishes until her hands cracked, and carried boxes heavier than her entire body just so she could afford a bed in a basement room. Was I happy? Eleanor murmured. No, sweetheart. But I was determined. And sometimes determination feels close enough to happiness that you learn to pretend. She smiled softly, though sadness lingered beneath it like a bruise. One winter night, thin from hunger and dizzy from working 2 shifts back to back, she fainted on the icy sidewalk. The memory returned to her in flashes, the sting of the cold piercing her cheek, blurry legs walking past her. The fear that she and her unborn child would simply disappear into the snow and no one would notice. But then came a warm voice, gentle, steady, wrapped in compassion. Ma'am, hey, stay with me. Don't close your eyes. A woman with a red coat knelt beside her. Her name was Margaret, a nurse, a stranger who became an angel when the world felt cruel. Margaret lifted her, held her, checked the baby's heartbeat with her small stethoscope, and whispered, "You're not alone, okay? You're not alone." Eleanor's voice cracked telling this part, because sometimes strangers save us in ways even family never will. She carried the story forward, her eyes distant as she relived it. She told Lily how she found herself living in a tiny, cold basement with walls that leaked when it rained, and windows cracked so badly that wind slipped through them like ghosts. Yet even in that miserable room, she would place her hand on her belly every night and whisper, "We are going to make it, little one." And for the first time since arriving in America, she believed herself. "When your uncle was born," Eleanor said, her lips trembling into a small smile, a blizzard was shaking the whole city. The wind sounded like it wanted to tear down the world, and the snow piled up so fast the streets disappeared. She had been working in a bakery that day, washing trays and cleaning crumbs to earn enough for the rent. The smell of warm bread filled the room when suddenly her water broke, soaking the floor between the ovens and the cooling racks. Panic rushed through her. Pain followed quickly after. Mr. Romano, the old Italian baker with a kind heart and a loud voice, dropped everything and ran to her. He wrapped her in his big wool coat, muttering frantic Italian, and drove her to the hospital in his rattling, ancient car. Snow slammed against the windshield as if trying to stop them. With every contraction, Eleanor gripped the torn upholstery and screamed through the chaos. "Don't push," he yelled over and over. "Wait till we get to the hospital." But the baby had other plans. The city roared. The storm howled. And inside that rusty little car, between fear and pain, a new life started to rise, stubborn, loud, and determined. Just like his mother, Lily exhaled slowly, her eyes shining with awe. She held her grandmother's hand a little tighter. "Grandma, you were so strong," she whispered. Eleanor shook her head softly. "No, my love. I was just a girl who had no choice but to keep going." She looked at Lily's small fingers, the softness of her touch, and felt the warmth of a future she had fought so hard to earn. "Strength," she said quietly, "comes when the world gives you no other option." The room fell silent for a long moment. Outside, the evening turned darker, and the soft glow of the lamp washed over their faces like a tender embrace. And in that stillness, with pain remembered, love shared, and generations connected, the story continued to breathe, waiting to unfold the next chapter. The room grew quieter as the night deepened, the soft hum of distant city sounds blending with the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock. Eleanor's gaze softened, drifting into memories that lay buried under decades of silence. Lily watched her grandmother's face closely, sensing that the next part of the story held a different kind of ache, the kind that leaves its mark long after the wounds have healed. Eleanor took a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against Lily's as if grounding herself before diving into the pain of the past. "After your uncle was born," she began, her voice gentle but weary, "life became even harder than I expected." She remembered the tiny apartment she managed to rent, a one-bedroom space with chipped walls and a heater that worked only when it felt generous. Every morning, she wrapped her newborn son in layers of blankets to protect him from the cold drafts that seeped in through the windows. She would hold him close to her chest while standing by the stove, trying to warm both their bodies with the flicker of the flame. Her hands shook back then, not just from exhaustion, but from fear that she wasn't enough, fear that she couldn't give him the life he deserved, fear that her sacrifices would never be enough to keep him safe. She worked endless hours cleaning homes, washing dishes, caring for other people's children while her own child slept alone in a makeshift crib made from a laundry basket. Eleanor's voice quivered as she spoke of those years, remembering how she hurried home between jobs just to kiss her son's forehead before rushing out again. "I barely slept," she whispered. "I barely ate. I lived on leftover bread and tea just so he could have milk." And yet, even with all her sacrifices, the world continued to test her. There were days she had to choose between rent and food, between electricity and medicine. There were nights she cried silently while rocking her sleeping child, her tears falling onto his blanket as she begged God to give her strength. But not all memories were painful. She smiled faintly as she recalled the way her son's laughter echoed through the small apartment, brightening even the darkest corners of her life. He grew quickly, small, energetic, curious, a child with eyes full of questions and a grin that reminded Eleanor of everything she was fighting for. On Sundays, her only day off, she would take him to the small park near their building. They couldn't afford toys, but he loved chasing pigeons and collecting fallen leaves. Eleanor would watch him run with the wind, her heart swelling with hope that maybe, just maybe, their future would be kinder. Years passed, and the boy grew into a young student. Eleanor swallowed hard as she spoke of how proud she felt watching him walk into school with his backpack, a backpack she had bought by cleaning offices late into the night. She told Lily about the time she stood outside the classroom during parent-teacher meetings, unable to understand most of what the teachers said, but smiling anyway, because they always told her that her son was bright, hard-working, special. She had dreamed of giving him a life she never had, a life without hunger, fear, or loneliness. I wanted him to grow up without carrying the weight I carried, she murmured. I wanted him to feel chosen, not abandoned, but life has a way of twisting what we love most. As her son grew older, the distance between them grew too, not just in years, but in heart. He wanted to fit in, to be like other kids who had parents that spoke perfect English, who owned cars, who lived in nice houses. Eleanor could not give him those things. She remembered the first time he snapped at her in frustration, embarrassed by her accent, irritated by her worn clothes and long hours. The words cut her more deeply than he could ever understand. It wasn't anger, it was shame. Shame that she, the woman who had given up everything for him, was now the source of his discomfort. Still, she kept going. She attended his school plays even when she didn't understand the lines. She clapped the loudest during his award ceremonies. She stayed up late mending his shirts and reheating his meals, even when he returned home without a word. She worked harder, hoping he would one day see the love stitched into every sacrifice she made. But youth is blind, and pride grows quietly in the hearts of children who don't yet understand what their parents endured. Eleanor's voice grew softer as she told Lily about the night her son turned 18. He had packed his things, announced he was moving out, and said he needed space. She remembered standing by the door, her hand trembling on the knob, watching him walk away without looking back. That night, she sat alone in the silence of the apartment, staring at the empty chair where he used to sit, feeling the weight of loneliness crush her from the inside. I knew he didn't understand then, she said with a sad smile. But I prayed that one day he would. Lily blinked, tears forming in her eyes. She squeezed her grandmother's hand gently, her young heart unable to imagine such pain. Eleanor looked at her with a tired but loving smile and wiped away one of the tears with her thumb. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered. "That's life. Love is not always returned, but it is always worth giving." The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the window softly. The lamp's warm glow flickered, casting moving shadows across the walls, as if the past itself was trying to speak. Eleanor leaned back, her breath slow but steady, her eyes glistening with the weight of memories that shaped her into the woman she had become. And in that quiet moment, as Lily rested her head on her grandmother's arm once more, the story waited patiently, knowing that the deepest chapters were still ahead. The night had thickened outside, settling softly over the small home like a heavy blanket, and the quiet inside deepened until the ticking of the clock felt almost like a heartbeat. Eleanor's eyes drifted toward the window for a long moment, watching the faint outline of tree branches swaying in the dark. Her breaths were slow, controlled, but Lily could feel there was more, something heavier, something deeper, something her grandmother had kept buried for far too long. When Eleanor finally spoke again, her voice came out low and hollow, like the echo of footsteps in an empty hallway. "Years passed after your uncle moved out," she began, her fingers gently tracing circles on the fabric of her dress. The apartment grew silent, too silent. A mother learns to grow with her child, but she is never prepared for the empty chair he leaves behind. Lily snuggled closer, sensing the ache beneath her grandmother's calm expression. Eleanor's eyes softened, but the sorrow in them remained, a shadow that refused to loosen its hold. She told Lily of her life in those years, long days at work, longer nights spent alone, her only comfort the small radio she kept near the kitchen window. She worked tirelessly, not for herself, but so her son could build the future she had sacrificed her youth for. She never complained, even when her back ached so badly she could barely stand, even when the cold winter mornings made her bones feel like brittle glass. She lived for the hope that one day he might visit, might ask how she was, might need her again the way children once need their mothers with quiet desperation. But life doesn't follow the hopes of a mother. Her son grew into a man who was proud of the successes he built, but ashamed of the foundation that made them possible. He came back sporadically, staying only long enough to eat a warm meal or borrow some money. Each time, Eleanor watched him walk in with the confidence of someone who believed he had lifted himself up alone. She never reminded him of the nights she stayed awake sewing his torn clothes, or the mornings she left for work before the sun rose just to keep his dreams intact. Love, to her, was not something you advertised. It was something you quietly endured. Her voice trembled as she recalled the first time he brought home the woman who would become his wife. Eleanor greeted her with warm arms and her best smile, offering her the dish she had spent the whole afternoon preparing. But the woman barely touched it. She sat stiffly, glancing around the small apartment with subtle disdain, wrinkling her nose at the old furniture, the faded curtains, the scent of boiled rice still lingering in the air. Eleanor had felt her heart shrink as she realized this woman saw her not as family, but as the kind of burden her son had never wanted to acknowledge over the years. The distance between them grew wider. The calls became fewer. The visits nearly stopped. Eleanor would sit by the window in the evenings, knitting or peeling apples, glancing every few minutes at the phone on the table. Sometimes she would pick it up, as though her touch alone could will it to ring. But it stayed silent, the stillness taunting her with a loneliness that felt sharper than any blade. When he finally did call, it was not out of affection. It was out of need. Money, favors, help with errands, someone to watch the children, everything except the one thing Eleanor craved most, to hear him ask how she was. To hear even a hint of the little boy she once rocked to sleep in her arms. Still, she gave and gave and gave. A mother's love does not shrink with neglect. It expands, hoping its size might fill the spaces others leave empty. Lily felt her grandmother's fingers tighten slightly, and she held on, her small warmth grounding the memories that threatened to pull Eleanor under. Then came the day, the wound that still glowed beneath her grandmother's voice like a bruise that never fully healed. Eleanor's breath hitched as she spoke of the phone call that changed everything. Her son, with a tone that was too casual for the weight of his words, told her that his wedding was happening soon, and that it would be better if she didn't attend. Not because there was no space, not because of sickness, not because of logistics, but because it might make things uncomfortable. That word had stayed with her, carving itself into the chambers of her heart like an engraving. She remembered sitting down on the edge of her bed, her hands frozen, her ears ringing as though the world had slipped underwater. Her son's voice on the phone felt distant, unfamiliar. She had whispered, "I am your mother," barely able to hear her own voice. But he had replied coldly, "It's complicated. Double quotes complicated. Another word that meant, you are not enough. You are not wanted. You do not belong." She remembered staring at the dress she had carefully sewn for the occasion, soft blue fabric that reminded her of the sky after a storm. She had stitched every seam with care, imagining the moment she would watch her son take his vows, imagining the warmth of being included, of finally being seen again. But that dress hung untouched, draped over a chair, the threadwork as silent as her disappointment. For months after the wedding, Eleanor kept her pain tucked away. But it surfaced in small ways, the way her hands lingered on old photographs, the way she avoided the mirror because she feared seeing the hurt etched into her eyes, the way she prayed at night not for herself, but for the strength to forgive someone who didn't even realize what he had taken from her. Lily had begun crying without realizing it, her tears slipping onto Eleanor's arm. Eleanor reached out, wiping them with the same tenderness she had once shown her son. "Don't cry, sweetheart," she whispered softly, though her own voice quivered. "Life teaches us in ways we don't always understand. Sometimes the people we love most become strangers. And sometimes, strangers become the ones who love us most." In the silence that followed, Eleanor closed her eyes and let out a long, trembling breath. The shadows on the walls shifted as if the past itself was slowly retreating, allowing space for the present to breathe again. And in that tiny room, lit by the warm glow of a single lamp, a grandmother and her granddaughter sat wrapped in both sorrow and love, one passing down her wounds, the other absorbing them with a heart too young to understand but too pure not to feel. The night continued, unhurried, holding them both as the story moved toward the chapters still waiting to be told.